Hi everyone, welcome back to CMN 201 for, believe it or not, our last class of the semester before the final exam. So, where we left off last class is watching Get Out, which is the last major movie that I have assigned for the semester. And your Get Out journal is going to be due today if you are watching this video on Wednesday, the 14th at 11:59 p.m. But if you need additional time, just let me know. But what I wanted to do in this concluding class was to talk a little bit about Get Out and also to leave you with the documentary since we began with a documentary. You don't have to write a journal on this documentary, but I think it gives a nice sense of closure to everything we've been talking about over this semester. And it's called Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. It's perhaps one of the criticisms I have of the first documentary that we saw at the beginning of the semester, that it was very Eurocentric and quite Caucasian. And this documentary, which came out rather recently so that they could make commentary on texts like or films like Get Out, came out in 2019, talks a little bit about the idea of black horror and ethnicity within the horror genre. Something that we saw a little bit of with some of the previous movies we've seen, for instance, Night of the Living Dead, when we had our black hero, but probably not as explicitly as something like Get Out, which honestly led to the creation of this particular class. After I saw the movie, I thought that this is something that would have to be developed into some kind of a course. Our next class, which is on Wednesday, of course, on the 21st, is when we will have the final examination. And I will be posting that at 6 p.m., which is when we would normally be meeting if we were meeting in person. And you would have a 24-hour period to return that to me. If we were taking that exam in class, you would have approximately 2 hours. So that's about how long you should be devoting to the exam. You shouldn't be thinking about the exam as something that requires 24 hours of work. But the sense of the exam is a way for you to synthesize everything that we've talked about over the course of the semester. And it is open book, open notes. So you can utilize things like our class discussion forum questions, which I've fallen behind with a little bit, by the way, but I plan on catching up with, so that you will be getting my responses. And you can utilize things like the class videos and your notes and other elements. This is also when your final project is going to be due, which is on Wednesday, the 21st. So the hope is that you've got your final project almost done so that you can devote yourself to getting ready for the final examination. So in terms of the film Get Out, as we were talking about, it's an interesting mix of horror and comedy, by Jordan Peele, who was known as a comedian before he basically established himself, and starting with the film 2017 as a filmmaker, making social and political commentary. He went to Sarah Lawrence College. He majored in puppetry, believe it or not, and then he left to form his own comedy improv group. And now he's a horror director, which was one of his dreams since he was 13. And he talked a little bit about, or he has talked a little bit about, how he's always fascinated by the genre because of its great possibilities for symbolism and metaphor, which is something that we've been talking about over the course of this semester. He won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. He was the first black winner to win that award. And he created Monkey Paw Productions. If you are familiar with The Monkey's Paw, which happens to be a short ghost story by James, then you know where he got the term for Monkey Paw Productions. And that was a story from 1902, by the way, Monkey's Paw, where you've got 3 wishes. So that's all I'll say about that story, but let's just say that one should exercise caution when they are using a monkey's paw. Quite unnatural. The soundtrack of the film, right from the very beginning, sets the theme. It's called Listen to the Elders, sung in Swahili, an African language, and the lyrics are about trying to warn. So we get a sense of foreshadowing right from the very beginning. And the song by Redbone Childish Gambino, and Stay Woke in the lyrics, and that's one of the messages of the film, is that we need to be awake and we need to see what's happening in our world. And it's that song is about a woman breaking trust in a relationship, and of course we definitely see that in Get Out. It's a commentary, of course, on 2010's racism, that unfortunately is still applicable in the 2020s. There was this hope in the 2010s that with an election of a black president, that we were in a post-racial world. Sadly, that's not the case at all. And that the real monster ultimately is our real American monster is about racism. And that's something that we as a country have to in one way or another come to grips with. And the history of slavery, and that slavery still continues. And certainly you can talk about economic slavery in the 2020s. But we see all of the microaggressions in this film that mask this huge macroaggression, and that these characters are literally taking black bodies and inhabiting them and turning them into kinds of slaves, if you will. But we see how these ignorant and awkward elite, through these seemingly innocuous comments, are basically focusing only on ethnicity, and that this is the reality of somebody who is a racial minority, especially a black man, that this is constant and this is inescapable. This sense of the pun of the title, Get Out, I've always appreciated. Obviously, Chris should get out. He needs to leave. But the idea that Jordan Peele is trying to get out the message about what racism is like and how we need to stay woke. And there's also the sense that sometimes Get Out is used as a sense of an expression of disbelief. Like, get out. I don't believe this is happening. Oh, this is happening. So at the very beginning, we see a black man who's out of his element. He's in white suburbia. And the subtle details in this film, it really does warrant multiple viewings. The car, the predatory car that comes after our first character introduction is white. You know, the idea that white is preying on black. Then we're introduced to Chris, whose last name is Washington. Of course, there's a long history about African Americans losing their names and being basically given the names of historical figures. Washington, probably the name most associated with the first president of the United States. And they owned slaves, by the way, the founders of the Constitution. But nevertheless, Chris is a photographer. In other words, he can see. He sees things that others don't. And the argument is that racial minorities can see things that oftentimes others don't. When he is introduced to his girlfriend, Rose's, Armitage's father, the father says that he's a collector, collecting treasures. And of course, that's quite literal, as we will see as the movie progresses, that he's collecting the bodies of blacks. Lots of foreshadowing in this film. So at the beginning, Chris cuts himself with white shaving cream. The idea that something white is going to be harmful to him. We see Rose at the beginning of the film, who is selecting sweets for consumption. And that's how she thinks of the men and women that she's dating who are black, that they are basically things to consume. The father tells Chris that there's black mold in the basement. And again, that's how he thinks of blacks. We see how the initial episode of where they run over a deer, Chris and Rose. The sense of deers as being prey. We see a stuffed deer on the wall. In fact, that's something that Chris uses to protect himself later on in the film. We see things like stuffed lions, again, the little stuffed animals that blacks are viewed almost like prey. And it's no mistake that at the ending of the film, Rose is dressed almost as if she was in a safari wearing khaki and basically holding a shotgun. Um, and the idea of what is the perfect human, definitely this sense of eugenics is embedded within the film, that the physicality of blacks and the intellect of whites would result in the perfect human. That's the coagula idea, which comes from the word coagulate, which means to clot or to transform, which is what basically the society is trying to do with blacks. Um, we know that Chris is haunted by his past. He has been paralyzed by fear in the past, as we see the child Chris watching television, not necessarily able to address the truth that his mother has been run over. Think about the poetic justice of that when Chris basically abandons Rose in the street at the ending of the, or in the road at the ending of the film. And of course, we find out about the coagula theory when Chris is strapped to his chair as an adult and he is forced to watch television again. And perhaps that also is a commentary about TV being a kind of pacifier, so that individuals will be zombie like and not be woke to the reality of the world around them. And perhaps that's not just happening to the disenfranchised, but to American society as a whole. Lots of irony in this film. So when Chris is strapped down to that chair and he has to watch, note that he uses cotton that he's able to get from the armrests of the chair to put it in his ears so that he can't hear. Again, cotton's so important in the history of slavery, since slaves were made to pick cotton. So now this subverts the idea of cotton. Also, the sense that of blocking out the media message, which can manipulate and can, in some ways, paralyze an individual. The symbolism of the sunken place is usually one of the major things that are talked about in this particular film. That sunken place is supposed to represent the place of marginalization and oppression for all disenfranchised groups. That basically they are repressed by the dominant group. And the message of this film, well, there are many messages, but one major message is that minorities perceive the truth, but they're told that they're wrong in their perceptions, which is something that goes on throughout the film. We see again how this black person is trapped and controlled in a white person's mind, as representing the idea of blacks being trapped and controlled in a white person's world. We're introduced to a blind man at one point who basically says to Chris that he's colorblind. And I think that's so important as well, because the message is that even individuals who claim or even are colorblind, so to speak, when it comes to ethnicity, are responsible for hurt and harm on others, whether deliberately or subconsciously. And of course, we definitely see that within the context of this person wanting what he says, Chris's eyes. He wants to be able to see. This theme of seeing, and how many of us don't see the truth, and how we need to see the truth. And that Jordan Peele is going to show us that truth. The alternate ending I talked about, that I had wanted you to watch, is obviously much more negative. Jordan Peele showed it to sample audiences, and the reactions were mixed. It probably is much more realistic. It's probably what would have happened to Chris, regardless of all of the evidence to show that he was innocent and that he was the victim. He'd probably end up incarcerated, as many African American males are. But it seemed it was too dark. It was too depressing for many of the audiences. And Jordan Peele made an executive decision to have more of a happy ending, if for no other reason, because Chris, our hero, deserves to live. And after we've been through Chris and we've experienced the subtle and not so subtle racism against him, that sense of joy of being able to survive. But it's a mixed ending because although he survives, that doesn't necessarily mean that he has escaped the world of racism and prejudice. He will go back to all of those microaggressions and perhaps even other kinds of macroaggressions because that's what the return to normalcy is for a black man in America. What is it like to be black in America? At least according to Jordan Peele, and for our character Chris, it's being under constant and obvious racism that's sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle. And that said, I encourage you to watch Horror Noir, History of Black Horror, that not only talks about Get Out, but talks about the history of the black experience and portrayal in horror. It's an hour and 23 minutes. And our last discussion forum question, I've fallen a little bit behind with the discussion forum questions, but I will be catching up this weekend. And as you know, you're not required to respond to the discussion forum questions of your classmates, or their responses, I should say, but you are required to read their responses. That'll be due on Friday, the 16th at 6 p.m. And again, if you need a little bit of time, just ask me. What film of this semester did you find to be the most significant and why? Out of all of the films that we viewed over the course of the semester, and I don't have a film for the 2020s. We're still rather early on in the decade of the 2020s. But what film of the semester did you find to be the most significant and why? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will have our final examination. Take care. Bye-bye.